say, education is the best economic policy there is. We, the students of BGTI, should consider ourselves fortunate enough to have a speaker who will give us valuable insights into the fields of economics and finance. The imponderable amounts of effort, wit, and wisdom which is put into strategizing and planning for a leading public sector bank is indeed commendable. Today, we have with us Dr. Soumya Kanti Ghosh, Group Chief Economic Advisor, State Bank of India. Previously, Dr. Ghosh has worked with Tata AIA, American Express, and ICRA, among others. Hello, sir. We welcome you all. Nehan, I think there's some issue here. Anyway, he has been a co-author in a pioneering work to capture payroll data in India for the first time, both for formal and informal sectors. Following his report, Employees Provident Fund Organization and Employees State Insurance Corporation have started to give out monthly payroll data. Dr. Ghosh is currently a member of the working group set up by the Government of India for the revision of Wholesale Price Index. He also serves as a member of the Indian Banks Association's Monetary Policy Group and provides input to the Reserve Bank of India's Expert Committee regarding the monetary policy framework. For successive 3 years, 2018, 2019, and 2020, Dr. Ghosh has been ranked as one of the best individuals in research in India by the Asset magazine. He has also authored several publications on the Indian economy. Furthermore, Dr. Ghosh has a gleaming academia. He has received his MPhil and PhD in economics from the illustrious JNU Delhi. It's a privilege to have him with us today. Thank you so much, sir, for being here. We are going to have a very interesting discussion on what the future of Indian economy holds, the recently announced Budget 2021, and various economic trends that are appearing due to the economic revival. So can we start off with the first question?
Yeah, please start.
Many students don't know how to describe what economy is or what it constitutes. So according to you, how would you define economy for a layman? Do you think that there's a significant link between economics and engineering?
Yeah, good evening, everyone. It's great to be among the students and few and far between. So, but it's always a pleasure to be here digitally and to speak to young students. Regarding the point which you raised regarding economy and engineering, let me tell you something. Let me start with an example. I think as students, all of you are now significantly familiar with the you must be familiar with this Nobel Prize, which is awarded in all subjects starting from economics, physics, chemistry, peace, and everything. I think just 1 year back in 2019, one Indian was awarded the Nobel Prize along with her students. I think you must know his name. His name is Banerjee, and his student also Esther Duflo prize along with him. So Banerjee, to be more precise. Now, in today's world, the most important part of economics, and economics has been always a fascinating subject. Even today, at this designation and even at this age, I am learning every day. There is a lot of things to learn, and as you know that whenever you have things to learn, it makes your job interesting. And if you ask me the specific question of how economics and engineering are actually correlated, there is nowadays, the maximum demand is for students who are in engineering and then who goes for economics, because at the end of the day, economics is a large part of the economics is basically mathematics. It's primarily a lot of it is coding, and all these data sciences, analytics, machine learning, what we are doing today is actually a part which we can relate directly to engineering. And there has been also a lot of students there then went to economics, Dr. Raghuraman Rajan, the former governor of RBI, he was also came from physics. He did, and then he joined IIT, IIM Ahmedabad for his physics. So, and then he went abroad. So there is another example is Dr. Viral Acharya, who was also a deputy governor of RBI at some point of time. He is also from this Trans School of Business, and he's again the aptitude in the mathematics. So a large part of economics is related to engineering, and the most promising, exciting, rewarding, remunerative, and interesting area today is the mix of engineering and economics, because you can actually do the analytics and data sciences, because at the end of the day economics is nothing but data sciences if you are in applied policy making, which as an economist of the country's largest bank we have to continuously engage with. So from that point of view, I think if anyone at any point of your time in your career wants to pursue a degree in economics after engineering, I think you are most welcome, and possibly you will find it most exciting also to do that degree.
Yes, sir. Sure, sir. So my second question, the COVID-19 pandemic has been disastrous for the Indian economy, especially because of the very stringent lockdown imposed by the government. What steps do you think will be necessary to ensure that the economy gets back on its feet and the growth moves into the double digits in the coming few years? What roles will the RBI, the government, and the banks need to undertake to accomplish this?
See, I think if you know, the pandemic actually has been a disaster once in 100 years. In 1918 and 1920, we had this famous Spanish flu. And then in 2020, we had this pandemic. When it started in 2020, I mean, in the beginning of the year, all of us actually were not aware that this crisis would reach such endemic proportions. But unfortunately, the crisis engulfed in endemic proportions. And as all of you students, you should have also felt the pain, and you're still feeling the pain in the sense that you are not being able to attend the classes physically. Possibly most of you are attending classes digitally. We also at our office have attended office digitally for a significant amount of time, but we have now been attending office from November. Now, see, the issue is that this pandemic has been a crisis which is outside the system. If you look into the history of economics, and if anybody wants to Google, you will find that there has been a lot of crisis in the history. The 2008 global financial crisis, which happened because there was some irregularities within the financial system. But this crisis happened because there was some problem from the health. So the crisis actually came from outside the system. And one of the most peculiar characteristics of this crisis was that this crisis actually had significant, enormous impact on the economy. I'll come to that point of how it has impacted the economy. But the important point is that even though it significantly impacted the economy, the impact was actually uneven. You know why? Because in economy, as you always know, there are two primary components. One is the manufacturing, and is the services. Manufacturing is basically the industry where you all are working, and services basically it could be tourism, it could be travel, it could be transportation, it could be any other thing whereby people are engaged in providing services. The problem is that when the economy was put in a strict lockdown from April to June, both manufacturing and services were impacted significantly. But after the economy was opened up, after the significant lockdown from April, May, June, in July, when the economy was opened up, the manufacturing sector actually witnessed a significant recovery because the industry was allowed to work out. But what happened was that the service sector was not allowed to open. For example, even today also there's a restriction on how many people can go to a hotel, how many people can go to a movie, how many people can actually travel in a bus. So what has happened is that the manufacturing sector has significantly recovered in the last, after the crisis was, after we opened up the economy, but the service sector has not been able to recover. And the demand the second thing is that the increase in the demand which has happened, a lot of people are saying that it is pent-up demand because the economy was closed for a significantly longer period of time. So therefore, the increase in the pace of economic activity happened very faster. Even all of us, all economists, and even people at International Monetary Fund, World Bank, everybody was expecting that the economic recovery could be significantly larger, but that did not happen because of several other reasons. I mean, that is a matter of debate which we can always discuss if we have time. But the point is that the manufacturing sector recovered significantly faster. That's why today all of us believe that the economic contraction this year for the Indian economy could be much lower than what it was anticipated. But the problem is that a large part of this recovery could be one-sided because the service sector, it has no pent-up demand. In the sense that, for example, if suppose you have missed a vacation in May, or if you have missed going out with your friends for lunch in May, that is, you cannot compensate by taking 2 and 3 lunches today, or you cannot take 2 and 3 vacations at one point of time. So what in service sector has gone out, pent-up demand, there is no concept of pent-up demand in services, there is a concept of pent-up demand in manufacturing. Therefore, the demand from the Indian industry has been mostly that you should support the services sector. If we ask me how the government has done it, the government has actually carefully crafted and support package for the Indian economy. But that was largely to deal with the poor people so that no one goes without food at any point of time. So the government has actually spent a large amount of money in feeding the poor. The second thing which the government has done, government has also supported the industry, but in a manner, through indirect manner. For example, one way of supporting the industry could be giving loans to the small and medium enterprises by giving a guarantee to the banks. Giving a guarantee to the banks means if any of those people doesn't pay back, the government will pay back the amount. So that is not a direct hit on the part of the government. So a large part of the government program for the small and medium enterprises was guarantee. Food was also provided free of cost to the poor people. The states were provided with a lot of support in terms of having the health infrastructure. There was also other support mechanisms like providing lifting food grains from the agricultural sector. Service sector, there was some amount of support was given, but the service sector is still in a recovery mode. So therefore, if you ask me how the government has responded to the crisis, it has responded well. And in terms of the RBI, I think the central bank actually has helped the economy in terms of getting people to buy loans at lower cost of borrowing. So that's why it has reduced the lending rates. There is a concept of repo rate by the RBI, which is basically the signaling rate. If you reduce that rate, the banks automatically reduces their rates. So people have got loans at lower rate of borrowings. For example, today, if you are going to buy a house, you can get a loan at less than 7% rate of interest. So the RBI has also given a lot of liquidity to a lot of market players. So there is a lot of non-bank financial companies, there's a lot of banks, there's a lot of non-bank financial companies who borrow from the banks. So all this RBI has actually ensured that this borrowing cost remains significantly on the lower side. It has also ensured that there is a lot of money which remains within the system, so that the government, so basically what the government is doing is basically supporting is supporting everybody in terms of having a fair price for each of them. So everybody's role was different, but my sense is that all of us has played their role to the perfection. And at the end of the day, I think we have come out of the crisis much stronger, better, and that is perhaps because of the resilience of the Indian economy. I will just take 1 minute to explain what is the resilience of the Indian economy. There is a survey. If any of you go through economic survey, or if anyone have gone through our reports, which is on the State Bank of India website, you will find that India has actually handled COVID significantly well. If we just assuming that the population, there is an econometric concept which I'm not getting into that, but the simple thing is that India, the number of cases in India are far lower than what it would have been if even if we take the population as a factor. States which have poor health infrastructure like Uttar Pradesh, Bihar has done much well than some of the advanced states like, say, for example, Kerala, Maharashtra and others. So that is one of the reasons for the resilience of the Indian economy. And I can guarantee you that the Indian people today has developed a sense of herd immunity. So therefore, I mean, that doesn't mean that all of you go out immediately, but my sense is that perhaps the worst is over in terms of the COVID crisis. And from here on only, I don't think, and India has actually successfully avoided the second wave, third wave, and it will remain like that in the future also.
Yes, sir. We look forward to it. So the third question is, India is touted to be one of the best performing economy in the emerging economies, and hence one of the best in the world. What makes our economy so distinguished from the other economies?
See, the point is that Indian economy has a lot of important characteristics. Our people are our strength. We have a young country. Our demographic, our average median age of work is around 26. So that makes us one of the youngest in the world. But that also makes us responsible in the sense that we have to provide jobs to all these young people. The other important thing, as I just said, is the resilience of the Indian people. The Indian people are actually very smart. The young people the young specifically today have a sense of purpose and a sense of trying to do something in the worst of the circumstances. And given the way they have tackled I can tell you that given the way the current younger generation have tackled the COVID in the last 1 year by sitting at home and attending classes, that in itself is an humongous achievement, because I can tell you that even if at our time, if that had happened, but obviously at that point of time, the internet was not so strong, but it would have been difficult for us. So it talks about the resilience of the Indian people, and my sense that makes that makes India the most distinctive part of the world, because Indian people are everywhere. Indians have the faith in themselves. That's one of the strong points of us. And so if you give anything to do for any individual, and we have excelled in everything, starting from economics, starting from physics, starting from engineering, starting from medical sciences. And today I was actually seeing a photo which came up in 1947, and today in 1947 India was actually asking vaccine from countries like Canada. Today we are providing vaccines to all countries in the world. The last number of countries were actually 20. So this speaks of the efficacy of our people, the efficacy of our scientists. And that's why I always say that, yes, there could be some problems in life. In terms of, for example, maybe some of the things which you do in the India is not that remunerative if you compare to the other countries. But as a nation, we are great. And that actually we should always savor that greatness and uniqueness of our people and culture, which is very difficult to find anywhere in the world if you travel there.
Yes, sir. Sir, my next question is, what impact will the economic policy centered around Atmanirbhar Bharat will have on imports and exports, and hence on our economic growth?
See, I think Atmanirbhar Bharat is a word which is a concept. Let me give you an example here. I think there's a lot of discussion about the Atmanirbhar Bharat. Maybe at some point of time, if any of you study the Atmanirbhar Bharat packages, you'll be able to do more. But my sense is that, in 2008, when there was a global financial crisis, the US economy actually decided that it will now and there was, I think at that point of time, the crude oil has crossed $100. So that was at record highs. I think at one point of time, it started $130, $140 per barrel, then it declined. Now what US did, at that point of time, it decided that let us now enhance our cell production. So that actually paved the way for US actually becoming more dependent on shell production and less dependent on crude oil imports. In the same year, 2008, China also decided that let us now move up in the manufacturing space by concentrating first on the lower end of the manufacturing space. So this was both the China and US did at that point of time, and both of the strategies paid extremely well to both the countries. China today is now vacating the lower end of the manufacturing space, which India is actually trying to capture, has now moved up in the higher end of the manufacturing space. So if you now fast forward to the current case, the concept of Atmanirbhar Bharat actually looks same. use the crisis to your opportunity, build up your own capabilities, and reduce the reliance on imports, which actually, for example, you do from a country like China. And for example, do you know one of the strategies which the Reserve Bank of India and the Indian government has done is that they are trying to make the Chinese import stronger. Today, if you look into any products, the Chinese imports are pervasive everywhere. I have a statistics in front of me which says that last year, the total number of commodities which we imported from China were close to 7,000 items. So and this number actually has been coming down over the last 1 or 2 years. So the idea is that make India produce more on its own, build up its manufacturing capabilities, and give a subsidy to the people, not from, there's also give a subsidy to the companies in terms of a production linked, which is called the PLI scheme, which the government has recently launched for 10 sectors. This production linked subsidy scheme is different from an input linked subsidy scheme, whereby input basically means giving out a dole. For example, I am giving you say 50 rupees. You use this input to provide you use this input to produce something. But what the current government is doing, they are doing a production linked subsidy, whereby saying that if you are producing, say out of 4 units, if you are producing instead of 2, that means that will produce more jobs to people. So therefore, then I will give you a subsidy. So this is the difference in the approaches. The Atmanirbhar Bharat is trying to make India self-reliant, a manufacturing base, and not the case that India should actually become inward looking. So therefore, you will find a lot of discussion which says that this is making India inward looking. I am saying, sorry, it is not making inward looking. It's making India more self-reliant when trying to cut on the inputs and also trying to develop India as a manufacturing base, which in turn will also push up its exports over a point of time. And just one point over here, the entire concept of Atmanirbhar is also related to this export means in every sense, agri exports. For example, do you know that during the pandemic, when in every country's export had collapsed, Indian exports of agricultural commodities are actually significantly shot up during that point of time, because we are able to take advantage, and rural sector was the only sector which was open during that time. So this is a concept which is nothing new, and I am hopeful that if this, given the current budget, the type of the opportunities the budget is actually giving to the financial sector, this concept of making India self-reliant could play India big time in the next couple of years.
Yes, sir, absolutely. So as you mentioned the PLI scheme, I have a question on that. Many economic reforms are taking place in India, like this implementation of the production-linked incentive scheme, new farm laws, etc. Can you please elaborate on the primary thinking of the government behind these reforms?
See, I think reforms basically is something which India has been doing since 1991. There are some reforms which are easy to do, some reforms which are difficult to do, and which are the difficult reforms to do, as all of you know. These reforms are basically, for example, the agricultural reforms, the reforms in the banking sector, or some of the reforms which we have kept in the last several years and unable to do them. Let me emphasize in this context, since you asked me this question, I think which reform is the most important. For example, let me take the case of the rural sector. I think there I also saw some questions coming in terms of the rural sector. Let me tell you the agricultural sector problem in the Indian context. The agricultural sector, as all of you know, if I just rewind and go back 60 years, in 1960s, India actually was a country which used to import a lot of fruit from other countries like Russia. So at that point of time, the then Minister Lal Bahadur Shastri and others actually decided that enough is enough. India should actually become a self-reliant in its country, a self-reliant in food production. And that was the beginning of the Green Revolution. States like Punjab and Haryana gave India and significant support at that point of time by producing more of cereals. And that was the time when the Indian government decided that these farmers should have an assured buying from the government, which is called the minimum support price. So the government decided that it will announce a minimum support price at which rate it will buy the cereals from the government, later buy the cereals from the farmers. Later on, this was extended to 23 crops. Unfortunately, for whatever reasons, this MSP system is now restricted to only 3 crops. Why it is restricted to 3 crops? Because the Food Corporation of India infrastructure has not built up commensurately in the rural sector. Why it has not built up? There are several reasons. Because there is not much investment, private investment in agriculture. Agriculture is a sector which is dominated only by subsidies, and most of these are input subsidies. Input means you are getting just a point which I mentioned, that is that I give you a subsidy, we use the subsidy to produce something, but there is no subsidies which is linked to investment. For example, if somebody invests, so there is no concept of that. So what is assuming is that the farmers in the country is now around 14.6 for farmers. Out of these, around 80% of the farmers are small scale and marginal farmers. So the crops which are sold at the MSP and the government procures it, that is only largely the procurement of rice and wheat, which gives an assured income to prosperous states from Punjab and Haryana. And there, if you look into the average income of agricultural households of Indian states, the Punjab agricultural income of the Punjab households are 2.5 times that of India. So what the government is trying to do, the government is actually trying to give an option to the small and marginal farmers are unable to come to the mandis to sell the crops, because the mandis, there's a lot of politics goes over there. So therefore the government decided that let us try to see if the small and marginal farmers have an option to sell the crops outside mandis. But the large farmers are now apprehensive that if that is done, these mandis may go away, which I think is an incorrect proposition to believe, because mandis will continue to coexist in the country. And also the fact that, do you know that there is so much asymmetry in procurement of foods in India? For example, West Bengal, where from I came from West Bengal is the largest producer of rice. But West Bengal rice procurement from the FCI is almost zero. Punjab and Uttar Pradesh, second largest producer, Uttar Pradesh price procurement is at 10th place. But if you look into states like Punjab and Haryana, which are lower down in the production of, say, paddy, there the procurement is at the top place. So the point is that we have to develop an agricultural infrastructure so that the crops which come to the prices which the farmers get are good one. Today, the potato, you buy in potato chips. If I compare the potato chips for 1 kilo, it is around close to 275-300 rupees. But if you get, the farmers can only get 2 rupees by selling 1 kg of potato. So this distinction has to go away. And this is a very sensitive reform which the government is trying to do. I'm not sure, about the way the things are moving, how much it will be possible. But my sense is that some of the reforms like these are needed in the Indian context. Otherwise, we'll continue to remain an economy which only believes that giving out subsidies and doles will going to improve our system.
Yes, sir. So my next question is, why is there a gap between the expectation and reality of economic reforms? What steps can be taken to nullify or at least reduce this gap?
See, I think there is always a gap between, if you know, there is a term which is called that there is a gap between perception and reality. What is there in the perception, there is always a gap in the reality. And as I've said, just of some of these reforms, for example, this in Indian context, there is also a lot of noise made during the land reforms, which was done. The government tried to do in 2013 and 14, but had to sell this. The banking reforms, look into the public sector banks. The public sector banks and the private sector banks, the way a public sector banks has 20 restrictions, but the private sector bank has no restrictions. And out of this 20, after doing this 20 restrictions, the public sector banks are supposed to provide also do other things which are incomparable, like in private sector other banks. So the reality, the perception is that maybe the public sector is, some of the institutions are not efficient, but the reality is that at the end of the day, you have to do so much amount of other work and so much amount of supervision by entities of state control that makes difficult to have a level playing field with other entities. So tomorrow, for example, in this budget, the government has made a provision of privatizing 2 public sector banks and 1 general insurance corporation. But you have already seen in the paper that a strike has been called on the March 14th and 15th, and I'm sure that this could become a big issue in the coming days. But if you ask me, there is no option but to give the banks, the public sector banks, the public sector institutions, a level playing field to operate. Why today, for example, there was a scheme called Vande Bharat, whereby India was bringing back all the stranded workers abroad. Why for an Vande Bharat scheme today, the Air India only will have to take the flag? Why can't other airlines bring it? Because Air India is a national carrier. For example, as all of you know, there was a one private bank which actually was not did well. That was a Yes Bank, and that was actually rescued by the State Bank of India through a public-private partnership. But my question is that at the end of the day, the State Bank had to take that pain. Why not other banks? So therefore, the best thing is that because these banks are mostly under government, therefore there is an element of government control over here, which should be done, because there is also social service that this public sector institution should do in terms of financial inclusion which they are doing. But at the end of the day, then the competition should also be fair. So therefore, there will always be a gap between expectation, perception, and reality in terms of the reforms. Some of the reforms are very sensitive. Some of the reforms could be populist. Some of the reforms could be very difficult to do. So as long as you don't get over this perception, this gap will always remain, that why reforms are working slowly in a country like India.
Yes, sir. For the audience, we'll be entertaining the question and answer session after I finish up all the questions. So my next question is, the exorbitant disconnect between the stock markets and the economy has been subject of much debate. As the rally has widened, the wealth inequality because investors have gotten richer, while the poor, who mostly work in the informal sector, have lost their livelihoods. Is there a looming financial disaster in the stock markets, and to what extent is the informal sector of our economy affected?
No, I think this is a very good question. Stock market, there are a lot of quotes on the stock market. One quote is by economist John Maynard Keynes. A quote is there. There is also a quote. If you just go there, I mean, beautiful markets does not signify a beautiful economy, and this has been the case everywhere. In all other countries, it has happened. But let me tell you one thing. Stock markets, why the stock markets have run ahead, there are two parts to it. The first part is that why the stock markets have run ahead is that basically there's a lot of liquidity which was given by the RBI into the market so as to cope up with this crisis, and a large part of liquidity actually has went up to by the stocks. For example, the number of demat accounts which was opened during the crisis was significantly on the larger side. So that actually explains why the financial markets and the economy may not be linked that much, because financial markets driven by mostly by liquidity, but economy has been driven more by performance. But let me come back to the second part. The financial markets, if you look at the corporate results in the third quarter and the second quarter, they were significantly better than market expectations. And why they were better, and that actually explains a part of your questions in terms of the economy. Because these companies, what they did, and mostly the small firms, had significantly cut on the employee cost. So there was a number of employee rationalization. There was also some people lost their jobs. Some employees rationalized their costs. But the good thing is now that the employees are actually, the wages are getting restored. So therefore, the labor market was significantly disrupted. And that was also one of the reasons still today that consumption has not fully recovered. Because if you lose a part of your pricing power, economy and the stock markets. And to your specific questions that why the informal economy will be impacted, yes, the informal economy has been impacted. But unfortunately, in the Indian context, the data, there is no significant amount of data that can capture that part of the informal economy. So an endeavor on the part of the government has to make a large part of that informal economy formal. That is the reason why the GST was introduced in 2017. And I think around 20% of an informal economy has perhaps been formalized in the last 2 to 3 years. And the more the informal economy gets formalized, the more it is better for all of us, because that will only broaden the tax base. If it broadens the tax base, all salaried taxpayers like us, all of you will get the job market at some point of time, will have to pay lower taxes. Do you know that India is a country where perhaps the individual pay higher taxes than the corporates? And we are unable to change this narrative because the number of tax-paying people is significantly on the lower side. The agricultural sector, the people doesn't, pay taxes because of, as I said, populist reasons or sensitivity of the issue. But at the end of the day, if the economy gets formalized, the taxpayer base improves, and at the end of the day, your tax, my tax, all taxes will decline. So while there is a negative aspect to this informal part, in the sense that a lot of people could lose jobs, the positive part of if they come into the formal mainstream, all of us will get benefit in some sense or the other. You are on mute.
Sorry, sir, extremely sorry. So my next question, it's about the recently announced budget 2021. What is your opinion on the claimed historic budget?
No, I think I can tell you that this budget, which has been announced on February 1st, is really an historic budget, and it reminds us of the 1991 budget, which was announced. There's a lot of good things which has happened in the budget. I think the budget actually has tried to address the most of the issues, but without raising any taxes. Of course, the taxes on the petroleum, on diesel and petrol are now at record highs, and hopefully there will be some correction at some point of time. But what it has done for the financial sector, for example, it has now set up a bad bank whereby it will solve all the issues of the banks. It has sought up and developed a financial institution. It has tried to unify all the code in the securities market. It has actually tried to also significantly ramp up infrastructure spend on sectors like roads, like power, like telecom, which every sector which is construction, which is more capital intensive. It has also tried to address the issue of senior citizens by saying that they don't have to now file returns and the banks will do the needful. It has tried to address the issues of taxpayers in the country by reducing the number of years for taxpayers appeal to 3 years. It has also tried to help the NRI citizens. It has given tax incentives for affordable housing to so whatever you ask me today, it has also given a fillip to the agricultural sector in terms of trying to build up the rural infrastructure. It has given support to the SME sector. It has given support to the scheduled caste, scheduled tribes, and the women in terms of a lower amount of margin money of taking loans from the banks. So anywhere you ask me, I think, and the most important thing that the budget numbers have also become transparent. Earlier, what used to happen was that a lot of budget numbers were actually outside the budget. Now the government has put in all the numbers in the budget. So basically, whatever is the number in the budget, that's the true extent of India's fiscal position. So I think it's a good budget. It's a commendable budget. And even if we are able to do 70 to 80% of what has been said in the budget, it will be very important. And this, Gargi, gets me and another shot into the question which you answered about the disconnect between financial markets and economic performance. See, the market has been now going up from the last 11 months. So yes, there could be a disconnect between the markets and the economy, but the total amount of market capitalization in the NSE 50 stocks today is now around 60 lakh crores. So markets, so basically the point which I'm trying to say that markets can lie once, market can lie twice, market can lie thrice, but the market cannot lie 100 times, because at the end of the day, markets are always gives you a discounted value of the future cash flow. If that is the case, and the way the markets are behaving, and I can also tell you that this decline in the markets is unlikely to go away in a hurry. These markets will continue to go because the numbers in the budget are extremely realistic. So if this is the case, I think maybe at some point of time, maybe 1 year down the line, if we have another discussion, you will ask me, sir, why there is so much now similarity between the markets and the economy. So that's one limited point which I wanted to mention.
Yes, sir. So my next question is, how are the weightages of various sectors and industries getting decided every year?
weightage of the various sectors and industry, basically that depends on the government announcements. The government typically tries to give more weightage to sectors which are more employment intensive. For example, this could be construction, this could be housing sector, this could be the reality sectors. So whichever sector gives more employment to the people, the government gives a focus on that. And the other sector which the government is also focusing basically on developing the social infrastructure. There is also the banks also have got a lot of attention from the government, because the government is doing a lot of social inclusion initiatives. For example, the Jan Dhan scheme, the scheme for providing free gas cylinders, the Ujjwala scheme for the poor people. Then this medical, yes, one more thing in the budget which I forgot is the significant emphasis on the medical infrastructure, the health infrastructure. So which is investing in human capital. So whichever sectors the government sees that it could provide more employment and build up more human capital, which could give you more dividends in the future, the government is actually giving more weightage to those sectors.
So when you mentioned now about the reality sector, so what was that? Reality sector?
Reality is the real estate sector.
Okay, sir. So the next question is, in 2020, the RBI reduced the interest rates to record low, and the finance ministry had announced stimulus packages. But all the steps were met with skepticism, and there was a buzz that the government wasn't spending enough to revive the economy. What is your view on this, considering the budget 2021 just got out?
No, if you ask, see, that's why I said at the beginning that the package which the government has introduced, a large part of the package which the government has introduced was basically to support the economy through indirect mix, because the government's fiscal position is also not that bad. So what the government was giving is that it said to the banks that you provide loans to the MSME sector, we will give you guarantee, in the sense that if the SME doesn't pay banks the loan, the government will reimburse the loan. This is basically the concept of this guarantee. So, but there was also a debate that the government should put more money in the hands of the people. But the idea of the government was that when the economy was closed and put more money in the hands of the people will not help, because people have nowhere to go out and spend. And perhaps a part of this was also correct, because the balances, for example, the government had put the cash balances in the Jan Dhan accounts at that point of time. But we saw that there was a significant build-up of balances in these accounts. In fact, the deposits with the public sector banks and all other banks significantly has jumped in the current fiscal year, implying that people actually have not spent the money. So that was one of the reasons which was given by the government. So if you ask me that why, there's two sides of the story. That if somebody asks me that why money was not put into the hands of the people, the first point is that yes, that could be a valid question. But the other side of the aspect is that if you are putting money into the hands of the people, there should also be an avenue to spend at some point of time, which was not available because of the pandemic. So there are two sides to it. But the good thing is that the economy has perhaps recovered faster than what it was anticipated, and that has helped the government to move ahead with more structural reforms, more than what they could have anticipated.
Yes, sir. So my next question is, you have conducted remarkable works on the payrolls. Can you guide us by explaining the concept of payrolls, and what role does it play in formulating economic reforms?
See, payroll basically is a concept. It's a different concept. It's a concept than employment. Payroll is basically, we have looked into the numbers with the EPFO, and I've tried to find out how many people are actually their provident fund are getting deducted from their salary. So based on that, we had estimated that this was the total amount of, and these people are all in the formal sector. So based on that, we are actually able to bring out the total amount of formal employment in the economy. There is an aspect to it that but however, the point is that a large part of these jobs are actually on the lower end of the spectrum. So the recommendation which I had made at that point of time to the government, that why you should start capturing the data from the EPFO system, the NPS system, the National Pension Scheme system which the government has introduced. But these are all low paying jobs. So therefore, you should start building up the technical capabilities of Indian youth, and to that end, it is because the problem which India faces today is basically not of unemployment typically, but of underemployment. Basically meaning that you may be qualified, but you are not getting a salary commensurate with your qualification. There could be also be other reasons that there are qualified, there are jobs which requires more amount of quality, but you are not getting people from the market. Perhaps so there is an asymmetry in demand and supply in the market, which the Indian government needs to do. And my sense is that this payroll study was an attempt in this direction to make government aware of the problems in the Indian labor market in terms of demand and supply mismatch.
Okay, sir. That's informative, sir. So my next question is slightly industry specific. In this pandemic, the banking industry has been frequently in the news because of low credit offtake and their reluctance to lend money. There have been diverse perspectives about NPAs of banks. In the bigger picture of economy, where does the banking industry stand, and why banks will play a major role in economic growth and revival?
So banks are always supposed to play an important role in the economy. Right now, if you look into the banks, the supply, there is a famous law in economics which was said by Sayes. There's a gentleman called Sayes who said that supply creates his own demand. So basically, if you have more supply, ultimately a demand will be created. Perhaps that was the motto of the current government, whereby it had actually used on changing the supply side infrastructure at the beginning of the pandemic. And the roles which the Indian banks are supposed to play is providing loans to people at affordable rates, so that they can use that loan to resurrect their consumption. And if you ask me, to that extent, their banks have largely been successful. What has happened is that the home loan rates currently are at lowest levels. For example, from a State Bank of India, you can get a home loan at 6.7%, which was unheard of even 2 to 3 years back. So if you are a good borrower with a good credit history, you are sure that you will get a good loan from a reputed institution, and if you can use that loan judiciously, you can build up your own infrastructure, which basically could resurrect the demand in the economy. So from that point of view, banks actually have played a very good role. And the important point is that this concept of this bad bank, which has come over in the budget, that's an excellent concept. And this also could allow the banks to get out of the crisis very quickly, because at the end of the day, what it will mean that the banks will just take out all the loans which are gone bad on its books and will transfer it to a bad bank, which will be set up by the government and the banks. So therefore, the banks will be able to concentrate only on the good loans and the good borrower, and it will save a lot amount of their time to run after people who have not repaid their money.
Sir, can you elaborate again on the concept of bad banks?
See, the bad bank basically is a concept whereby in accounting what you do is that, for example, if a bank has, say, rupees 10 rupees or 4 rupees have gone bad and 6 rupees is good. So what the bank then does is 4 rupees of bad loan is taken out from the bank balance sheet, and that is put out into the balance sheet of a bad bank which is set up by the government. Then the job of this bad bank is to ensure that the recovery of these rupees 4 is made from to whatever extent it possible by the people who are employed in the bad bank, and not by the people in the original bank. So the original bank then gets the time to concentrate on taking decisions on loan, which basically will resurrect the economy, instead of spending more time of recovering the bad amount from these people who are not paying back. So it's basically a saving of time, a saving of manpower, rationalization of cost requirement, and rationalization also of manpower and money, which helps the bank to leverage the existing strength to the significant extent, so that it can reach to the more number of borrowers than it were unable to do, because of a large part of its employees were actually held up running after people who have not paid back the money.
Okay, sir. So my next question, you have been contributing your work to the RBI and the SEBI. What is the contribution of these or any regulatory bodies in survival and growth of the Indian economy?
See, RBI is a regulatory institution. SEBI is also a regulatory institution. The role of the RBI is basically setting interest rates and trying to see that the inflation remains under control. But at the end of the day, the Reserve Bank of India is also accountable to the Parliament. So therefore, it frames policies which are in the interest of the of the individuals. For example, during the pandemic, the Reserve Bank of India has taken a lot of policies which was in the interest of the people, in the sense that it ensured that the people were able to borrow at the lowest possible cost. So that is one aspect that the Reserve Bank is supposed to do. The SEBI, the Security and Exchange Board of India, is engaged more in orderly function of the securities market, saying that people are not taking unfair advantage of, taking out information and trading in stocks or artificially inflating prices. So SEBI is the organization of that. So these organization regulated entities are arms and functions of the financial system, which helps in orderly and smooth functioning of the financial markets.
Okay, sir. So my final question. The financial crisis induced due to COVID-19 is regarded as a black swan event, a term used to describe something very rare. What are emerging economic trends that we will be witnessing going forward, and few words of wisdom you would like to share with us as we come to the end of our discussion?
See, this is a very interesting point, but black swan event, I think this is another thing. If anybody of you are interested in doing maybe at some point of time analytics and something, I mean, in the future, one research which I think surely people of you of your age and your the interest will be engaged in. I think what has happened in the last several years is that these events of black swan events have becoming more of increasing regularity. So, for example, in 2008, we had this black swan event, and a black swan event typically happens once in 100 years. So now see again in once in 10 years, we had another black swan event. In 2013 also we had an event. In 2001, we had the terrorist attack. So 2001, 2008, 2013, 2020. In 94-95, there was a significant crisis of a Russian crisis of one. In 1992, there was a Harshad Mehta scam in the stock market. So 92, then there was, I think 2000, there was also a dot-com bust. So if I piece together all these events, all these events actually are events which are now making the black swan events are actually working like regular swan events. If I just put on the lighter in analytics, they should actually try to capture why this is happening so frequently, and they should try also to take this as a part of our model assumptions. So I am sure that this is one research which has not yet which has not yet started, even in the Indian context, even globally, whereby trying to make sure that these tail events are incorporated as a part of the regular analytic exercise which the institutions do. A part of this was done in the Basel, whereby the banks were told to hold more liquidity. But I am sure in the future, this will be a very big area of research of trying to understand that why people are, for example, some people are more susceptible to the crisis and some people are less susceptible to the crisis. So the people who are more susceptible to the crisis, they will get loans less amount, and who are less susceptible will get more loan amounts. And this is exactly what the institution could try to do at some point of time in the future. And let me come with a positive example over here. I think any crisis, any crisis, if we ask me, has given birth of a lot of companies. Uber was one of them, Microsoft was one of them, General Motors was one of them. I have already seen a lot of companies on the digital front. First of all, some companies are giving a run for money to Amazon. I think the name of the company is Software something, which came into out an Economist. But I'm sure that this pandemic could actually give out options for Indian companies to grow. On digital front, we have expanded it significantly, and my sense is that take this as an opportunity to grow and not lose time on whatever has happened, because whatever has happened. We should now move forward in this regard.
Definitely, sir. We'll keep that in our minds. Thank you, sir. We'll now move on to our interactive question and answer session. To the audience, you can ask the questions by unmuting your mics, or you can type in the chat box also.
Good evening, sir.
Yeah, good evening. Tell.
Sir, my question is about bad banks you have mentioned earlier.
Yes.
Sir, are not bad banks going to increase our deficit, fiscal deficit, because there are already many laws there to prevent these assets, non-performing assets. So why we need new institution now?
No, I think the concept of bad bank is not going to increase the fiscal deficit because the banks are already provided for these. There is a concept which is called provisioning. So the banks have already provided for the bad assets which are not going to come back in their balance sheet, and they now just need to recover the money so that they can write back the money into their balance sheet as and when it comes back. So there is be no impact. So it is fiscal deficit neutral because fiscal there is something money which the government will spend, and in this case, the bad bank will be set up by the banks itself. The equity support could actually come from the support could come to the from the government in the form of a guarantee, which is not a direct fiscal support, so no impact on the fiscal deficit. But why a bad bank is needed? Do you know why? Because right now the banks actually have provided almost 90% of their bad loans in their book, so 10% they have to provide. So the point is that when they have provided 90% of bad banks in their portfolio, and if they are going, if and so and given the size of these bad loans, some point of time, the banks actually waste a lot of energy, time, and manpower in trying to recover that money. So instead, the concept is that, and in one loan there could be several banks. For example, State Bank of India, Bank of Baroda, ICICI Bank, HDFC Bank, all could have lent to a particular borrower. So if that loan goes bad, all the banks have to sit down and take a common call of how to make a recovery. Sometimes what will happen is that because of paucity of time, the banks cannot take a call how they should go about recover. For one bank could be one view, the other bank could have different view. So what this bad bank typically will do is that this will make the consolidation of this capital, because it will be transferred to one single entity, bad bank, and that person will be responsible for all the decisions which will be taken, and all the banks will have to abide by the decision. So this will save time, this will save manpower, this will be also save disaggregation of capital, and this will also bring in players from abroad. For example, there is a lot of players abroad who are experts in this market of stressed assets. This is called a stressed asset market, whereby they buy these assets and actually sell this buy these assets and then try to sell this, recover this amount. And please note that most of these loans which have gone bust, these actually are backed by very good assets in the Indian context. The problem is that if a loan is not repaid over a period of, for example, a power plant, suppose the power plant has gone bad and it was because of a reason that at this point of time the economy was not doing well, but the power plant has its assets. The problem is that if you are unable to recover, if the power plant goes bad, then the assets which are not working over a point of time, these assets could also get dysfunctional. So the advantage of trying to do a recovery faster through a bad bank is enormous, because since these are all backed by very good assets, this will come back to production very quickly if the money is recovered and if the units are made operational. Because please note that most often the loans go bad not because of the fault of the corporates, but because of business expansion plans, because of the economic the cycle assumptions which the company may not have any control in the beginning. For steel is the most common example because as you know, when the economy does well, the commodity prices go up. When the economy does badly, the commodity cycle goes down. So at some point of time, most of the steel companies, and there was a lot, as you have heard about these steel companies that by RIA, which has now been transferred hands, given to this, I think, London-based company who has taken over. So the idea why it did badly, because when this steel company decided for expansion, the steel prices were actually holding at $20,000 or $30,000. But when the crash started, the prices collapsed to $1,000 or $2,000. So therefore, this is a complex assumption. So my sense is that an institution which deals exclusively on this will do much better than any particular bank, because this will have the required expertise to deal with that.
Yes, sir. So the next question is by Anudeep. Anudeep, you can ask the question.
Okay. Thanks, Gavi. Good evening, sir.
Yeah, good evening.
Hello. Sir, as you mentioned, the concept of bad bank which is introduced. So my question will be in the coming fiscal year, will be there a good recovery in NPS or there will be more registering cases in IBC?
No, I think see the you have to also understand that 2008 when the banks went into the crisis, they had less amount of capital and they had not adequately provisioned for the bad loans. But in the current crisis, the banks have gone with more amount of capital because they were recapitalized. They have provisioned all the bad loans on their balance sheet. 90% of that has been done. So banks are very well positioned to take on the crisis. And there was also a report which the RBI has done, the Kamath Committee report, which was the Kamath Committee report, which was which the RBI did. As I can tell you that the request for restructuring of the loans for the banks, which has come from some of the stressed accounts, has been very much on the lower side. Part of this restructuring accounts always gone for NPA. But the initial thought that this banking sector will have an avalanche of NPA is absolutely incorrect, and even the banking sector will be the most positive surprise which we will see in the coming decade. If for example, any of you has followed the financial markets, State Bank of India, which had announced the results on 4th February, it was in the history of State Bank of India that its shares were frozen on the upper side for twice during that year, and it has never happened in the history of the State Bank. So the idea is that the banks are actually much safe and sound, and the lot which has been said about the banking sector asset quality right now will not be correct. Of course, there will be some problems on some industry, like for some sectors like MSME, but that is a matter of time. But that is one of the reasons why the financial sector is looking so healthy, and the market is actually doing so healthy. The financial stocks are doing so healthy after the presentation of the budget.
Okay, that's great answer. So my second question will be like IFC authority bill, which was introduced in 2019. So it will be helpful in coming budget, opening new markets for international people to come in and with much less restriction, like special economic zone were there. Now we have come up with IFC security bill. So how you see this bill
No,
adding
I
more
think
input to the budget?
No, these
Budget?
are actually positive developments in the budget. This will basically make internationalization of the Indian economy much more better. And the more we actually do these things, the more it will actually attract foreign capital. In the last 1 year, if you remember me, all countries had witnessed equity flows from the foreign institutional investors negative. But India was one of the only country where it got 25 billion equity inflows, positive in equity inflows. The FDI flows were more than 70 billion in 2019-20. So I think these are developments which are required and which will add the much needed value to the Indian markets.
Okay, so last my question, as you mentioned that RBI mostly manage the repo rates and the inflation rates. So in the long run, will India will also go into negative rate of interest like European countries and Japan are now into
No, that though,
zero rate of interest?
So I think at the end of the day, do you know what zero rate of interest means? Zero rate of interest means if you have taken a loan of 50 lakhs from a bank, the banks will pay you back 25 lakhs to you. So at the end of the day, basically it is writing. So I don't think that is a fair proposition to think of basically the negative real rate of interest, because that is something which means that the banks are paying back on people too. So I don't think we'll reach that case, but I am sure with the type of policies which the central bank has been doing, this RBI actually has been doing more of policies which are not from the textbook economics, but this has in India the policy making. If I ask me out of two types, one is discussion based policy, one is rule based policy. The central bank has been doing more text rule based policies in the last several years, but this RBI under the governorship of Shaktikant Das has been doing more discussion policies, basically making more innovative policies. So if you ask me, the India could be in for an extended regime of stable interest rate and stable exchange rate, and that perhaps will be the best thing to have happened to the Indian economy in terms of growth, because any country which has grown faster with these stable interest and exchange rates is the example of China, and I am very sure that India could actually replicate that. And from that point of view, this RBI and this government has been doing a fabulous role. If I have time, if I answer other questions, I'll give a very good example at the end of this, how the RBI and the government has been working together in this pandemic.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Sir, our next question is from Harish Singh. Harish? So there was a question by Harshal Wagmare. What is liquidity real estate credit score? How and who can earn credit score?
See, credit score is a score which is given to each borrower based on his repayment history, and the credit bureau in the India actually does this, which is the CIBIL. So if you want to get a loan tomorrow from the banks will first look at your credit score. If you have a good and better credit score based on your repayment record, you will get a loan and at reasonable rate of interest. And liquidity is basically the amount of money which the RBI, Reserve Bank of India, gives to the banks. When the banks borrow from them, there is a separate window from whereby the RBI actually, the banks can borrow from the Reserve Bank of India by using the government securities which they hold as a collateral. So that is the liquidity, and that amount could be increased or declined depending on whether you want to keep the liquidity more or liquidity less. And this more amount of liquidity and less amount of liquidity actually helped us to navigate through the system of this pandemic crisis very efficiently, because the RBI had given significant amount of liquidity to the banks. The estimates of this liquidity actually is around 6 trillion. So which is basically around 5% of India's GDP. Or I think it is 8 trillion, which is 4% of India's GDP.
So that's really informative. Sir, our next question is by Aditya.
Hello, sir.
Yeah.
So my question is, as we were discussing about the crisis, means from 2008, 2016, and that bubble crisis, we are saying that all these bubble have formed, and how to predict these bubbles means you are talking about analyzing the data, and we India need many more analysts in that space. But I think in 2008, our former RBI governor Raghuram Rajan predicted that it is the housing bubble. So how can a normal man, or as being an analyst, someone can predict that, or how to identify that?
No, it's very difficult to predict that crisis. For example, this housing loan bubble, actually this point Dr. Rajan which is mentioned was actually also mentioned by Nurul Rubini, who is a famous economist. So but he did not say it explicitly, but it was said by Dr. Rajan explicitly. But the important point to note is that there are several parameters for that. For example, in the Indian context, how do you know that the corporates are going to face a crisis? Because their financial ratios actually had got significantly bad, the debt equity ratio and other things. And so that's why all of them went bad. The assumptions which were made, that all of them went bad. In 2006, when this crisis happened, this 7-8 for the Indian banks, also the loan to value ratio, which is basically if you are taking a housing loan of 100 rupees, if the loan to value ratio is 90 to 10, that means you have to only put in 10 rupees, the banks will have to put in 90 rupees. So at that point of time, it was seen that in some cases the high loan to value ratio were one of the reasons why the banking sector went past. So there are several ratios, but to me, if you ask what is the most important, I think everybody has learned from the crisis. So, but if you ask me today in terms of, then there's also could be the external sector whereby if the ratio of short-term debt is on the higher side, that could be indicator of crisis. Also in the external sector, if you see that a large part of the loans are actually not hedged, basically there's always a risk of exchange rate. So if you have taken a loan in the exchange rate of 65, if it depreciates to 70 rupees, you have to pay back more. So if it is not hedged more, so there are several parameters on that one. It depends on which one you look into, but the idea is that you should always cut your cloth according to your according to your abilities. So if that is the case, and I don't think if you follow that principle dictum even today, I think a large part of this crisis which we face could always be avoided.
So the next question is by Vedant. The government is privatizing most of the government-owned institutions. So how does that affect the economy of India and its effect on people of India?
No, I think, see, I'll tell you one thing. At the end of the day, if you ask me, privatization is not the panacea for all the ills for the Indian economy, nor is public sector the dominance is the panacea of all ills. But why the government is actually, at the end of the day, government should only be in the business whereby it can make money. For example, there is no business, there is no point that the government is actually holding back into all sectors with more regulation. I remember in telecom sector before, in 1980s and 90s, in the telecom sector, I mean, you remember that how difficult was to make a phone connections at that point of time. But then the Indian government decided to make an exit, and now look at the telecom sector today. I mean, there's an avalanche of one. So the government should actually make an exit from sectors whereby, apart from strategic interests like defense, where security of the India's country is involved, it should not exit those sectors. But all other sectors, India actually should make India should try to make a measured exit with a measured amount of control, because that could bring in more efficiency, that could bring in more competition at the end of the day. But let me add a caveat over there, that at the end of the day, the privatization is not the panacea for all this, because we have also seen how the private sector had behaved in the 2008 crisis in countries like USA and others. And we have to be very careful and watchful that such things are not replicated. So a little amount of government intervention and control is always required in sectors, so that and that oversight is very important, because that at the end of the day will ensure that both the public and the private sector are a level playing field.
Thank you, sir. Sir, we are truly honored by your presence today. Thank you so much for being with us and enlightening us with all your valuable insights. Thank you, everyone. We appreciate you being here, and we'll see you the next time. Thanks again for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.